Premier of Ontario is joining us right now. Premier, thank you so much for joining us. This new plan is expected to be the most aggressive move yet by a tariff-consumed American president. What is the mood there in Ontario and indeed the rest of Canada as we await this announcement later today?
Well, thanks so much for having me on. And I start every interview saying how Canadians love Americans. I love Americans. We love the U.S. And what this is going to do is going to hurt American families. And the folks you had on just previous is 100% bang on. The lumber that homes are built, majority of it is coming from Canada. It's going to increase the cost of a house, the autos as well. We ship as many autos as we buy, but the cost of a pickup truck or an automobile is going to go up. And then the pharmaceuticals, too, that he's going to go after.
Welcome back, guys. A dam is here. Imagine the scene for a moment. The most powerful man in the world pulls up to the Canadian border. Secret Service vehicles everywhere. Motorcade ready to roll. Cameras positioned to capture the historic moment of a U.S. president crossing into America's closest ally.
So explain a little bit more why you call it Termination Day.
Well, we're the #1 customer. We buy more goods off the U.S. than any country in the world, more than Japan, the U.K., and France combined. And if you go after Canada, we have no choice but retaliate. And I apologize to the American people. We shouldn't be doing this. And they were talking about cheese. Well, on the dairy products, in the last deal that President Trump made, the U.S. hasn't even hit their quota. So there's never been a tariff until after their quota, but they've never hit that quota. But let's sit down and negotiate a trade deal. Again, President Trump ran on reducing inflation, creating more jobs. It's worked the total opposite. Consumer confidence is down, investment is stalled, inflation is happening.
And then a border officer steps forward, looks at the president's passport, looks back at him, and says those 4 words no leader ever expects to hear. You can't enter Canada. Sounds impossible, right? Sounds like the plot of a fictional thriller that would never happen in real life. Except under Canadian law, that scenario is not just possible, it's legally justified. Because Donald Trump, the President of the United States, is now criminally inadmissible to Canada.
Premier, is Canada prepared for these tariffs? How will your country retaliate?
Well, right now, Wolf, there's 40 million people at a fever pitch. They're engaged, and they're ready to sacrifice. And I don't think my great friends, and I have a tremendous amount of friends in the U.S., they're kind of going on their merry way until they get hit. And they're going to get hit hard based on President Trump continuing to tariff. But he's doing it on all fronts around the world.
And Canadian police, border agents, and immigration authorities have the legal duty to treat him exactly like any other convicted felon trying to cross their border. Let that sink in for a minute. While Trump sits in the White House threatening 100% tariffs, demanding Canada submit to his trade demands, and trying to project strength on the world stage, Canadian law classifies him as a criminal, a convicted felon, someone who, under normal circumstances, would be automatically turned away at the border. And the irony is so brutal, so devastating, that it almost hurts to watch. Trump wants Canada to respect him, to fear him, to bow to his economic pressure. But Canadian law says he's not even allowed to step foot in the country without special permission. He's demanding submission from a nation that could legally tell him to turn around and go home. Now, this hasn't played out as a dramatic arrest scene with handcuffs and patrol cars. Trump hasn't tried to cross into Canada since his conviction, but the legal framework is locked and loaded, ready to activate the moment he tries. And Canadian lawyers, legal experts, and commentators are making this crystal clear on air. They're walking viewers through the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act, section by section, line by line, showing exactly why Trump's 34 felony convictions make him inadmissible. They're explaining that if Trump were an ordinary person, a tourist, a business traveler, anyone without a Secret Service detail, border officers would have the duty, the legal obligation, to refuse him entry and say, "You're a criminal. You don't qualify to be here." And here is where it gets even more humiliating for Trump. Canadian politicians of all parties know the law. They know Trump is inadmissible, but they're staying quiet. They're being diplomatic. They're carefully choosing their words to avoid offending the American president, which means the responsibility of enforcing Canadian law falls to police and border agencies. The RCMP, the Canada Border Services Agency, the frontline officers who don't have the luxury of diplomatic language. Their job is to enforce the law, period, and the law says convicted felons don't get in. So while politicians dodge and weave, the people actually doing the work are the ones who would have to deliver the news. Mr. President, you're a convicted criminal under Canadian law. You're not admissible. Let's break down exactly how Canadian law works here, because this isn't opinion, this isn't media spin, this is black-letter law written into Canada's Immigration and Refugee Protection Act. Section 36 specifically deals with criminal inadmissibility. It says any foreign national convicted of an offense outside Canada that would be considered an indictable offense inside Canada is inadmissible. And what's an indictable offense? It's the Canadian equivalent of a felony, serious criminal conduct that carries significant prison time. Trump's New York convictions for falsifying business records? In Canada, that's fraud. And fraud under the Canadian Criminal Code can carry up to 14 years in prison for serious cases. That's absolutely an indictable offense. That's absolutely grounds for inadmissibility. The law doesn't say, except for presidents. It doesn't say, unless you're really powerful. It says foreign nationals. That includes everyone. The President of the United States is a foreign national in Canada. The law applies to him just like it applies to anyone else. Now, there are exceptions. Canadian law allows for something called a temporary resident permit. It's a discretionary waiver that can be issued to someone who is otherwise inadmissible if there are compelling reasons for them to enter Canada and if the benefits outweigh the risks. And for a sitting U.S. president, there are obviously compelling reasons: diplomatic meetings, trade negotiations, security cooperation. All of that creates pressure on Canadian officials to issue a permit, to waive the rules, to let Trump in despite his conviction. But here's the critical detail that changes everything. That permit is discretionary. It's not automatic. Canadian officials could choose not to issue it. They could look at Trump's tariff threats, his bullying rhetoric, his demands that Canada submit to American pressure, and they could say, you know what? The benefits of letting you in don't outweigh the risks. You're inadmissible. You don't get a permit. You don't get in. And that decision would be legally defensible. It would be following Canadian law. It would be within their authority. And Trump couldn't do a thing about it except throw a tantrum from the American side of the border. Think about what that means for Trump's negotiating position. He's trying to bully Canada into changing its trade policies. He's threatening 100% tariffs on Canadian goods. He's demanding they submit to his will. And Canada's response can simply be, you're a convicted felon who isn't allowed in our country. Maybe focus on your own legal problems before telling us what to do. That reframe is devastating. It completely undercuts Trump's strongman image. It makes him look weak, hypocritical, and diminished. How can you demand respect from a country that classifies you as a criminal? How can you threaten economic warfare against a nation that could legally refuse you entry at the border? The cognitive dissonance is staggering. And Canadian media is leaning into this hard. They're packaging segments with titles like Canada Police Drop Bombshell, You're a Criminal. They're walking viewers through the legal process, showing exactly how border officers would handle Trump if he showed up without a permit. They're interviewing immigration lawyers who confirm that Trump is criminally inadmissible, that his conviction meets the threshold, that the only thing standing between him and a border refusal is political discretion. And they're highlighting the irony that while Trump tries to project strength, Canadian law exposes him as someone who doesn't even qualify to enter. It's humiliating on a global scale. Let's talk about the political dynamics here because they're fascinating. Canadian politicians are trapped. They know the law. They know Trump is inadmissible. But they also know that publicly stating that truth would create a diplomatic firestorm. Trump would rage. He would retaliate. He would use it as proof that Canada is hostile to America. So they stay quiet. They let the legal experts and media commentators do the talking, but that silence creates its own problems. It makes it look like Canadian politicians are afraid of Trump, like they're willing to ignore their own laws to avoid upsetting him. And Canadians notice. They see their government refusing to enforce immigration rules against a foreign president, and it breeds cynicism. It makes people wonder if laws are just suggestions for the powerful. Meanwhile, the people who would actually have to enforce this, the border officers and RCMP members on the front lines, they don't have the luxury of silence. Their job is to apply the law to everyone equally. If Trump shows up at a port of entry without a valid temporary resident permit, the officer processing him has a legal obligation to refuse admission. They can't just wave him through because he's president. That would be breaking the law. So you have this incredible tension where politicians dodge the issue while frontline officers would be forced to deliver the devastating news if Trump ever actually tried to cross. And that tension is going to get worse the more Trump provokes Canada. Because here's the thing about discretionary permits. They're discretionary. Canadian officials don't have to issue them, and the more Trump threatens Canada, the more he insults Canadian officials, the more he demands submission, the harder it becomes for Canadian authorities to justify giving him special treatment. At some point, public pressure might force their hand. Canadians might demand that their government stop making exceptions for someone who treats them with contempt. And if that happens, if Canadian officials decide enough is enough and refuse to issue a permit, Trump faces the ultimate humiliation, being told he's not welcome in an allied nation because he's a convicted criminal. And this sets a precedent that could spread. If Canada can treat Trump as criminally inadmissible, why can't the UK? Why can't Australia? Why can't France or Germany or any other nation with strict immigration laws for convicted felons? Trump's conviction doesn't just affect his ability to enter Canada, it potentially affects his ability to travel to dozens of countries around the world. Every nation with laws barring convicted criminals from entry now has grounds to refuse him. Every diplomatic trip becomes a potential legal negotiation. Every foreign summit requires waivers and permits and special exceptions, and that fundamentally constrains his ability to conduct foreign policy. It makes him look weak. It makes other countries question whether dealing with him is worth the legal headache. And what's Trump's response to all of this? So far, silence. He's ignoring it, pretending Canadian law doesn't apply to him, continuing to threaten tariffs and make demands as if nothing has changed. But that strategy only works as long as Canadian officials continue to waive the rules. The moment they decide to enforce their law, Trump's bluff is called. He either accepts the humiliation of being barred from Canada, or he retaliates in ways that make him look even worse. If he imposes tariffs in response to Canada enforcing its own immigration laws, he proves their point that he's a bully who punishes countries for following their own rules. If he complains diplomatically, he admits that he needs Canada more than Canada needs him. Either way, he loses. So here's where we are. Donald Trump, the President of the United States, is criminally inadmissible to Canada. Canadian law treats him as a convicted felon who can be legally refused entry at the border. Canadian police and border agents have the duty to enforce that law. The only thing preventing a catastrophic diplomatic incident is the discretionary decision of Canadian officials to issue temporary permits. And the more Trump bullies and threatens Canada, the harder that discretion becomes to justify. Trump wants respect. He wants submission. He wants Canada to bow to his demands. But Canadian law says he's a criminal who doesn't even qualify to cross their border. And that contradiction, that brutal irony, is the story that's going to define U.S.-Canada relations for the foreseeable future. The bottom line is devastatingly simple. Trump is trying to project strength while being legally classified as inadmissible. He's demanding respect from a country whose own rules say he should be turned away. He's threatening economic warfare against a nation that could, at any moment, decide to enforce its immigration laws and tell him he's not welcome. And there's nothing he can do about it because the conviction is real, the law is clear, and Trump is, in the eyes of Canadian immigration authorities, a criminal. Period. Full stop. End of discussion. And that is going to haunt him every time he tries to throw his weight around on the world stage. Stay tuned, because this story is far from over.